Okay, let's start having a look at actually getting render passes out of Clarice and into Photoshop so that we can start painting over the top of our 3D layout. So the first thing we'll want to do is go to our image. In here, let's select our base render. And where we had the lights assigned as lights all group, let's just split it out into environment. And let's divide this again and let's view our image view. It'll be quite useful. So let's just select our environment and let's duplicate this and let's select our distant light. So we are essentially splitting these two lights out into two separate layers, so we'll have more control later on. Let's rename this to env_light, and this distant_light. So this will just give us a little bit more control later on, because we'll want to play around with the lights separately. It's just nicer to have that control in Photoshop than to have it in Clarice. So the next thing we will want to do is maybe create a material for the water surface, because currently it's just the same as everything else, and it would be good to have it actually behave like real water. So let's go have a look at our water, which I've played around with a little bit more. I currently have it under the city folder, but you know what, let's take this and put it into the geo folder. Okay, so we're one level up. Okay, and a problem arises. Let me disable one of those. In that now our geo all group here, it is set under geometry, shadows, etc. But our geo all group does not have the water in it anymore. But we can fix this by looking at our inclusion rule, which currently is set to include everything under scene geo city in this geo group. So water is currently outside of the city folder, or the city context rather. So what we want to do is modify this inclusion rule to include the water as well. And we can do this simply by clicking here. And if we click enter here, we're able to get another line to enter more rules. And let's just select our water folder, click here. Let's just copy that. And let's go into our group, and here let's paste it. And let's do /* for everything in that context. Let's click apply. And now you can see once again we have the water back in our render. If we look here, so we could just type in everything manually and use the semicolon to separate these two rules, but you can also do it this way by clicking the little dots there. So just a little something to remember. It's a good little trick. So let's actually create a material for water. Let's go into our shaders, and here let's just create a new context, and we're going to call it water. And let's go in it, and let's create a new material, physical, standard, and we're going to call this water_matte. In the settings, let's start off by changing the diffuse front color to something slightly more blue. Maybe slightly blue. You could argue that water should just be reflective, but I want a little bit of a dirty texture to it, like water that has algae in it. If you've seen ponds and lakes, things like that, where the water is just not perfectly clean. So let's use something similar to this maybe. Let me darken it. Actually, let's adjust these values manually. I want something more like this. I've written these down, so I'm cheating a little bit, but I'm just trying to get the correct color. Okay, we want something like that. Slightly dirty, slightly dark. And let's scroll down to here. And let's change the Fresnel preset to water. And what this changes is the index of refraction, which for water is 1.3 recurring. And furthermore, we want to change the transmission strength and color. So for the strength, let's put it up to 50%, and for the color, once you have the strength above 0, you can change the color as well. And let's just change this to something brighter, slightly green maybe. I believe the values I want are 0.09, 0.675, and this. Okay, so this is just, again, for defining the areas of the water where the water is shallow. And essentially, wherever it is shallow, I want to have a slightly greenish hue to indicate that maybe there is, I guess, plants and algae and seaweeds under the water. Somewhat similar color to this, maybe. And I'm playing around a little bit, and I'll improve it in Photoshop later, where I can just use this as a base and really bring in some more textures and colors. Now, let's, in the shaders, create a new context, and we're going to call this shading underscore layers. And here, let's create a new shading layer. Remember we talked about these earlier? So I'm going to call this standard underscore water. And I'm going to go into my environment light layer and select for shading layer my new shading layer. Okay. So by default, nothing is assigned. Everything is just assigned the standard material. By default, just gray. Let's, to our filter, add a rule where we'll add our water and the water material. If we go to our geometry and go to our water folder, you'll see that I have my water geometry named water and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So first of all, just a little bit of an explanation regarding my approach to this water. As you can see, I have my main water plane here, which I put in at a height that I wanted, just to define the general water level. However, for some areas, I wanted to raise the water level in order to create a more of a hierarchical tiered city effect. So here, you will see that I have a copied water geometry that I've raised up, and I did it several times. And this was just, I did not like the geometry underneath and the way it was stacking, so I thought it'd be a very cool effect to have this sort of a dam structure scattered throughout the city. So in order to make it make slight sense, I created some walls here too, in order to kind of segregate the water and hold it in and have it make sense, because otherwise the water levels are floating at several different heights. So I've just put in these boxes to block them off. Very simple approach. And I kind of thought it added to the overall feeling of the city, and it kind of makes sense. If you're building a city, and you have a rainy season, you probably want to have something like this when there's a lot of rain and waterfalls. So that's how maybe the people adapted to have these layers where they block off the water. So anyway, as you can see, all of my water geometry is labeled water. So here in the filter, we'll just enter star, water, and star again. So what this will do is it will select everything that is called water, and it can have anything in front of it. So for example here, the water has an address, which is project CNGO water water. And instead of writing all of this, I can just write star. It'll skip that. It means that any folder that has water in it will be caught in this filter. And afterwards I also want a star, meaning that there can be anything after. So here after the word water there's nothing, but here there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it'll, instead of having to select these numbers individually, I'll just be able to select them all using this symbol. And then for material, let us go into our shaders, water, and water material. Let's enlarge this slightly. Okay, so now our water material is on the water. And actually, let's go to our distant light and assign this standard underscore water shading layer as well. Okay, so actually it's more visible in that there's a bit of a problem in that our water is strangely transparent. So the reason for that is because the water material is transparent, and of course there is no ground underneath it. There is just a huge gap. So what we want to do is select all of these water planes and copy them and paste them. And let's find our manipulator. Let's just move these down somewhat. And we don't want these to be called water, because then we don't want them to be catching this material in the shading layer. So, oops, I lost them. Oh, accidentally deselected them. Let me just copy them again, move them, and let's right click and contextualize, and we'll call this bottom, and let's select them all and see if we can rename them. Okay, let's just go to our name here and click in bottom. Okay, so that way it changes for all of them. So we've got them all called as bottom. So my intention is to create a layer underneath to create a bottom for the, I guess, water reservoir. But as you can see, right now it's still not working. So why is it not working? Well, actually, we made a mistake here. In fact, by naming this water, I've enabled it to pick up not just the geometry, but the folder itself in which the bottom layer is. So instead what I want to do is rename this to water underscore geo. And now let's select all of these and rename it underscore geo. As you can see now, we have our water, and it's more correct. There is the underlayer, which just receives the standard material and not the water material. Cool. Okay, so if we go back to our environment light, that looks like it should be good. Actually, we can take our distant light and apply this as screen. If we again zoom out, again remember the render is still going at better resolutions. So actually I'll just keep it at normal. What I want to do next is create a render layer that has the water material applied to all of the surfaces facing up, because as I've mentioned earlier, I'm going to add some waterfalls, some rain maybe, and I want to have the ability to, in Photoshop, to have a material where it looks wet and I can apply it to whatever surfaces I want in order to make them look wet. So how are we going to do that? I think we can just take our environment light layer, copy it, let me put it up to the top, and I will call this wet underscore surface. And here we're gonna have to change our shading layer to something new. So let's go back to our shaders and let's go, yeah, in the same water folder I think we can create something new. Let's make a new material standard. And now let's create see if I can find it, multi-blend, and let me pause, or no, create a new material editor. So multi-blend is a function that allows us to blend multiple materials together based on rules. So what we're going to do is, into our layer 1, in here, we're going to plug in our water, and into our layer 2, we're going to plug in our standard material. And let me just disable these underneath. Okay. So, okay, now I've got both there. In the shading layers, let's create a new one. We'll just copy this and call it wet surface. Actually, let's put an underscore SL, just so it's clear that these are shading layers later on if we see them at a glance somewhere. So here, I've misspelled surface. Let's here change the filter to everything, so just a star. This will be picking up everything, and we'll change the material to our multi-blend, which we'll rename wet underscore surf multi-blend. And let's call this standard matte. So now everything will have this wet surface multi-blend applied to it. So the way this works is that it blends the two materials together, but what I want is not just to select some blending mode, but I want to add a rule for the weight. So I want everything that is facing up to have the water material on it, and everything that is facing sideways to just have the normal standard material. If I had the water material on everything, A, it will not be giving me the reflections that I want to use, and B, I would have to up my bounces for the light, for the reflective surfaces, to crazy numbers, because the light would just be bouncing around everything infinitely, right? Because everything would be reflective. So this might be slightly better. So let's just create a texture triplanar, and let's create a texture constant, and we'll call this, we'll call this constant color underscore black, and let's copy it, and we'll call this one white. Okay, so for the black, let's change the color to black, and for white, white. Okay, so we want, let's switch them maybe. We want the white to be plugged into the top, and the black to be on the bottom and the sides. So what triplanar does is it projects one of these textures, in this case just the constant color, from all directions. So right, left, top, bottom, front and back. So because I only want the white surface on the tops, that's where I'm plugging in my white, and the black I'm plugging into everything else. So here, let's plug this into the weight, and let's add an invert node. And basically now I'm getting the opposite of this. So everything will be white except for the tops. And I want that to apply to our standard material here. Okay, so now let's go to our wet surface layer here. And in the shading layers, let's select the wet surface. So this is a little bit difficult to see because it's quite dark. But if we increase the brightness and have a closer look, if I do my render region and then just focus on this little area, just to see kind of what's happening on a smaller scale because the whole render takes too long. That's a nice little trick, right? I recommend doing that a lot with your work. So we can see that the tops of everything are now reflective. So now this is successful as a wet surface material, and I will control where I want things to be wet in Photoshop, and we'll go over that later. So we can see that it works. Cool. So in fact, there is one more little trick that we can do to make our water shader a little bit better. Let's go into water material. Let's just expand this. Into our specular strength, we can plug in a gradient. And here, we want the input mode to incidence. And incidence locator, just use the render camera. And here, I'll create a white to black gradient. Basically, I can plug it into specular strength. What I can do is control the amount of specular based on the angle of the camera or angle of the object where this material is applied with regards to the camera. So anything that is more straight on is going to be less reflective, and anything that is at more of a side angle is going to be more reflective. If you look at water straight down, if say you're looking at a lake face down, you're not going to see much specular reflections, but if you look at it just along the surface, if you have your point of view right above the water and you look off into the distance towards the horizon on a lake, you will see that it will be much more reflective in the specular. So this is slightly better. I think we'll benefit from this later. Next, we're going to create some volume, which will interact with our distant light in order to create some God rays. So let's duplicate this. And let's call this volume underscore God rays. Okay. And in our geometry, we will create a new context, and we're going to call it volume. And in here, let's create a new geometry. And under volume, there is box. Do not confuse this with geometry box. We want the volume box. So let's add this, and let's create a new material, physical, volume. Leave all of this, all of these settings in the material as they are by default. And for our box, let's increase the size of it to cover our entire city. But we don't want to do it here. We want to scroll down to size and do it here. So let's do 1,000, 1,000, 1,000. And vertically we can decrease this to a few hundred meters. And so let's do 1.5 and 1.5. And let's just move this over our city. And we can make it a little bit bigger too. Let's move it so that it covers our entire city. That looks good. Okay. And now let's go to our shaders, shading layers, and let's create a new shading layer, and we're going to call this volume SL. And in our layer 3D, let's go to the settings, and we want the lights to only be the distant light. And let's assign our volume shading layer. And in the shading layer, let's create two rules. So first one is going to be, let's select the address for our volume box and paste it. And we want the volume material to be applied to that. And let's create a second rule, and it will be everything else. And material, we'll just go with our black matte, which is just a black matte material. I'm just keeping the settings at default with it. So this is just a black material which will not react to light and will not react to anything. So this will allow us to isolate the volume effect to be by itself. So everything else will be non-interactive with the light. Okay, so we have that. Now we want to go back into our geo, and let's copy our geo all group, and let's rename it geo all plus volume group. And in here we're going to add a third rule to include our volume as well. Apply. And now we want to assign this new geo group to, to all of our visibility settings. And now let's go to our volume box, and let's decrease the density, because currently it's at 1. 1 means that it is basically a solid, so let's decrease this to 0.1. That is still too much. Let's change it to 0.05. Okay, we can see something. Maybe 0.05. Okay, much better. So now, as you can see, we are getting an effect of the distant light rays passing through our volume, and this is physically correct. You could do this, of course, in Photoshop by just painting some rays of light yourself, but it's really useful to have this done in 3D, and you will know that this is actually correct and realistic as it would be in real life. So that's a great layer to have. Okay, so with these 3D layers set up, let us now jump to the next lesson, where we will set up some ID render passes which will help us isolate objects when painting in Photoshop in order to make our job easier.